My son sold my $7 million beach house without my permission. The next day he handed me a check for $5,000 and said, "Go live in some dirty garage somewhere." I just laughed and made a call. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I always knew this day would come. Not the specifics, mind you, but the essence of it. The day my son Brian would finally show me exactly who he really was. It started like any other Tuesday morning. I was in my kitchen making my usual cup of Earl Grey when I heard his car pull into the driveway. The aggressive way he slammed the door told me everything I needed to know about his mood. Brian had never learned subtlety. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice carried that tone I'd grown to despise over the years. The one that meant he wanted something, or worse, had already taken it. I set down my teacup and turned to face my 42-year-old son. He was wearing that expensive suit I'd helped him buy for his last job interview. The one he'd quit after 3 months because his boss didn't appreciate his vision. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a shine. Brian had always been handsome, and he'd learned early how to use that to his advantage. "What is it, dear?" I kept my voice steady, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on my kitchen counter with theatrical precision. "I sold the beach house." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. The beach house, my sanctuary, the place where I'd spent every summer for the past 15 years, where I'd planned to live out my retirement in peace. "You what?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "I sold it. $7 million. Pretty good price considering the market." He said it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "The papers are all signed. Deal's done." My hands began to shake, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Brian, that house is in my name. You can't just..." "Actually, I can." He pulled out another document, this one thicker. "Power of attorney, remember? You signed it last year when you had that little health scare. Said you wanted me to handle your affairs if anything happened." The health scare. A minor heart palpitation that had sent me to the emergency room for 6 hours. Brian had been so concerned, so insistent that I needed someone to help manage things. He'd made it sound like a safety net, a way to protect myself. I'd been so touched by his apparent care that I'd signed without reading the fine print. "But I'm fine now," I managed to say. "That was just a precaution." Brian shrugged, pulling out his phone to check something. "Doesn't matter. It's legal. Already went through. The new owners take possession next month." I felt the room spinning slightly. 15 years of memories in that house. The mornings I'd spent on the deck watching the sunrise over the water. The evenings reading in the sunroom. The guest room I decorated hoping that someday Brian might bring his family to visit. Back when I still believed he might settle down and give me grandchildren. "Where's the money?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Brian reached into his other pocket and pulled out a personal check. He placed it next to the sale documents with a small smile that made my blood run cold. $5,000, he announced. "Should be enough to get you settled somewhere new." I stared at the check, the numbers blurring through the tears I was fighting back. $5,000. From a $7 million sale. "Brian, what happened to the rest?" "Expenses," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Real estate fees, legal costs, taxes. You know how these things work. Plus, I figured you owed me a little something for all the years I've been looking out for you." Looking out for me. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. When had Brian ever looked out for anyone but himself? "Go find yourself a nice little apartment somewhere," he continued, pocketing his phone. "Maybe one of those senior communities. They have activities and such. You'll love it." He paused at the kitchen doorway and turned back with that same cold smile. "Or you could always find some dirty garage to live in. Your choice." That's when I did laugh. A real genuine laugh that seemed to surprise him. "Something funny, Mom?" I walked calmly to the phone hanging on my kitchen wall. The old landline I'd kept despite Brian's constant nagging about getting with the times. I dialed a number I'd memorized months ago. "Marcus? It's Marilyn. Yes, it's time. Execute Plan B." I hung up and turned back to Brian, who was staring at me with confusion and the first hint of concern I'd seen from him all morning. "Who was that?" he asked. Oh, just someone I've been working with, I said, sitting back down at my kitchen table and picking up my teacup as if nothing had happened. You see, dear, I've been expecting this day for quite some time. Brian's confident smirk faltered slightly. What do you mean? I took a sip of my tea, savoring both the warmth and the look of growing unease on my son's face. You see, I'd raised Brian alone from the time he was 8 years old. After his father died in that terrible accident, I'd worked 3 jobs, sacrificed everything, put myself through hell to give him every opportunity. And I'd watched him grow into exactly the kind of man I'd feared he might become. Selfish, entitled, cruel. But I'd also learned something important over the years. Sometimes the people who know you best are the ones who underestimate you most. Brian, I said softly, did you really think I didn't know what kind of person you'd become? Brian left that afternoon without another word. But I could see the questions eating at him. Good. It was about time he felt some uncertainty. As I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence he'd left behind, the memories came flooding back. Not the pleasant ones most mothers cherish, but the painful ones I've been trying to forget for decades. Brian was 8 when his father died. A heart attack at 45, sudden, devastating, and completely unexpected. One day we were a normal family planning our summer vacation. The next I was a widow with a mortgage, a mountain of medical bills, and a little boy who couldn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. I remember Brian's face at the funeral, so small in his borrowed black suit. He kept asking when we were going home, as if somehow leaving the cemetery would bring his father back. I held his hand and promised him that everything would be okay, that I would take care of him, that I would make sure he had everything he needed. It was a promise that would haunt me for the next 34 years. The first few months were the hardest. David's life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses and a fraction of our debts. I had to get creative fast. I took a job at a local diner during the day, cleaned offices at night, and did bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends. 3 jobs, sometimes 4, whatever it took to keep our house and put food on the table. Brian adapted to our new reality in ways that should have worried me more than they did. He learned to make himself dinner when I worked late. He got himself ready for school in the mornings. He never complained about my absence, never asked for things we couldn't afford. I thought I was raising a resilient, independent child. What I was actually doing was teaching him that love meant sacrifice, and that sacrifice always went in one direction. When Brian turned 16, I managed to scrape together enough money to buy him a used car. Nothing fancy, just a reliable Honda that would get him to school and his part-time job. I'll never forget his reaction when I showed it to him in the driveway. This is it, he said, walking around the car with obvious disdain. Mom, this is embarrassing. Can't you do better? I'd worked double shifts for 6 months to afford that car. I'd given up my own transportation and taken the bus to work so he could have the independence every teenager craved. But to Brian it wasn't enough. It was never enough. That should have been my first real warning sign, but I convinced myself it was just teenage angst. He'd appreciate my sacrifices when he was older, when he understood how hard it had been. College was another breaking point. Brian had decent grades but not scholarship material. The state school would have been perfectly adequate and within our budget, but Brian had bigger dreams. He wanted the prestigious private university, the one that costs more per year than I made in total. Everyone who matters goes to schools like this, he told me when I tried to discuss alternatives. Do you want me to be stuck in some dead-end job like you? Like me. As if the 3 jobs I'd worked to keep him fed and housed were somehow beneath him. As if the sacrifices I'd made were a cautionary tale rather than an act of love. But I found a way. I always found a way. I took out loans, worked even more hours, sold jewelry my grandmother had left me. I made it happen because that's what mothers do, right? They make it happen. Brian graduated with a business degree and grand plans. He was going to start his own company, make millions, show the world what he was made of. He just needed a little help getting started. Seed money. A small investment from his mother who believed in him. I refinanced the house. Twice. His first business failed within a year. Then the second. By the third failed venture I was starting to see a pattern, but Brian always had an explanation. Bad partners. Economic downturns. Markets that weren't ready for his vision. It was never his fault. When I was 58 I met Harold. Sweet, Patient Harold, who owned a small but successful construction company. He was everything David hadn't been: stable, predictable, kind. He loved me despite my financial struggles, despite my complicated relationship with my son, despite the fact that I came with a 40-year-old dependent who showed no signs of launching. Harold and I married 2 years later, and for the first time since David's death I felt secure. Harold was generous with Brian, treating him like the son he'd never had. He helped Brian start another business, bought him a condo, even offered him a position in his construction company. Brian took Harold's money and gifts with the same entitlement he'd shown toward my sacrifices. When Harold's business offered him a steady job with good benefits, Brian turned it down because it was beneath his skill set. When Harold died 4 years later, another sudden heart attack, another devastating loss, I discovered just how generous he'd truly been. He'd left me everything. The business, his savings, the house, and yes, the beach house that had been his pride and joy. For the first time in my adult life, I was financially secure. I sold Harold's construction business to his foreman and invested the money carefully. I paid off all my debts, set aside money for my retirement, and tried to enjoy the peace I'd never known. That's when Brian's true nature finally revealed itself completely. He'd expected to inherit Harold's wealth himself. When he learned that everything had been left to me, his mask slipped entirely. The loving son who'd been so grateful for my sacrifices became cold, calculating, impatient. He started talking about my advanced age and my declining mental capacity. He brought up the power of attorney constantly, suggesting I needed help managing such a large estate. The health scare that led to me signing those documents? Looking back now, I realized how convenient it had been. How quickly Brian had appeared at the hospital with papers already prepared. How insistent he'd been that I needed protection from predatory people who might take advantage of an aging widow. The irony was suffocating. But sitting in my kitchen that Tuesday afternoon, listening to the silence Brian had left behind, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: satisfaction. Because while Brian thought he knew me, thought he understood the weak, sacrificing mother he'd manipulated for decades, he'd missed one crucial detail. I'd been preparing for this day for 2 years. Marcus wasn't just anyone I'd been working with. He was Harold's nephew, the lawyer who'd helped me set up protections Brian knew nothing about. The power of attorney Brian was so proud of? It had limitations he'd never bothered to read. The beach house he'd just sold? Well, that was going to be very interesting indeed. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. Brian probably spent the night celebrating his windfall, completely unaware that he'd just walked into a trap 2 years in the making. Marcus arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that made people nervous. At 68, Harold's nephew had inherited more than just his uncle's legal practice. He'd also inherited Harold's protective instincts toward me. "Are you ready for this, Marilyn?" Marcus asked, settling into my living room chair. "Once we start, there's no going back." I poured him coffee and sat across from him, feeling more determined than I had in years. "I've been ready since the day Brian started talking about putting me in a home." Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Let's review what we know. Yesterday, Brian presented you with documents claiming he'd sold your beach house for $7 million. That's right. He gave me a check for $5,000 and told me to find somewhere else to live. The problem is," Marcus continued, his voice taking on that precise legal tone, "Brian can't legally sell that house. You see, when Harold left you his estate, I advised you to place the most valuable assets into an irrevocable trust. Do you remember that conversation?" I nodded. It had been Marcus's idea, a way to protect Harold's legacy from potential creditors, or, as he delicately put it, family members who might not have your best interests at heart. The beach house, along with several other properties, was transferred into the Marilyn Whitmore Trust 18 months ago. You're the primary beneficiary, but you're not the legal owner. The trust is. Marcus pulled out another document. The power of attorney Brian has been waving around only covers your personal assets and day-to-day financial decisions. It explicitly excludes any property held in trust. Brian had no legal authority to sell that house. The implications hit me like a physical blow. So the sale is completely invalid. Fraudulent, actually. Brian has essentially sold property that doesn't belong to him, using forged documents that claim you authorized the sale. I sat back in my chair, feeling a mixture of vindication and concern. But what about the buyers? They paid $7 million in good faith. That's where it gets interesting, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. I've already been in contact with the buyer's attorney. They're not happy. They've discovered the title issue and are demanding an immediate resolution. If Brian can't provide clear title or return their money within 30 days, they're prepared to file criminal charges for fraud. The room felt like it was spinning. Criminal charges? Wire fraud, forgery, possibly elder abuse depending on how the district attorney wants to play it. We're talking federal crimes, Marilyn. Serious prison time. I thought about Brian's smug expression when he'd handed me that check. The casual cruelty in his voice when he told me to find a garage to live in. Part of me felt sick thinking about my son facing prison, but a larger part felt something I hadn't experienced in years: justice. There's more, Marcus continued. I did some digging into Brian's finances like you asked. The $7 million from the house sale? It's already gone. Gone? How is that possible? It's only been 1 day. Marcus pulled out a bank statement. Brian has some serious gambling debts. Apparently, he owes money to some very unforgiving people. The moment that $7 million hit his account, it was transferred out to pay off creditors. He kept maybe $50,000 for himself, if that. The pieces of Brian's behavior over the past few months suddenly made sense. The expensive clothes he couldn't afford. The new car he'd bought for business. The constant requests for small loans that he never repaid. The growing desperation beneath his arrogant facade. So even if Brian wanted to return the money to the buyers, he can't. It's gone. Which means he's going to face the full legal consequences of what he's done. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden Harold had planted for me years ago. The roses were blooming, their red petals bright against the morning sun. Harold would have known exactly what to do in this situation. He'd always been protective of people who couldn't protect themselves. Marilyn, Marcus said gently, I need you to understand what's going to happen next. When the buyers realize they can't get their money back, this is going to explode. Brian will likely be arrested. There will be investigations, court proceedings, media attention. Are you prepared for that? I turned back to face him. Marcus, do you know what Brian said to me yesterday? He told me to go live in a dirty garage. My own son, the boy I sacrificed everything for, looked me in the eye and told me I was worth $5,000 out of $7 million. My voice was steady, but I could feel decades of suppressed anger finally breaking free. I've spent 34 years making excuses for Brian's behavior. 34 years telling myself that he was just going through a phase, that he'd eventually appreciate everything I'd done for him. But yesterday he showed me exactly who he really is. Marcus nodded slowly. So what do you want to do? I want to let the consequences play out naturally. No interference, no bailouts, no protecting him from his own choices. For the first time in his life, Brian is going to have to face the reality of what he's done. The buyers will file charges by the end of the week if they don't get satisfaction. Then Brian better figure out how to come up with $7 million. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying my face. There is one thing that might complicate matters. Brian could claim he thought he had authority to sell the house. He could say you misled him about the trust arrangement. I walked to my desk and pulled out a thick envelope. That's why I recorded our conversation yesterday. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. You recorded him? Harold gave me this little device years ago, said you never knew when you might need to protect yourself. It was running the whole time Brian was here. Every word, every threat, every cruel comment about finding a garage to live in. I handed Marcus the recording device. You'll hear him admit that he took $6,995,000 for himself. You'll hear him tell his own mother to go live in squalor. And you'll hear him show absolutely no remorse for destroying my life. Marcus plugged the device into his laptop and listened for a few minutes, his expression growing darker with each of Brian's words. When he reached the part about the garage, he actually winced. This is devastating evidence, Marilyn. With this recording, Brian can't claim he was confused or acting in good faith. This proves intent to defraud. Good. Because I'm done protecting him from himself. Marcus closed his laptop and looked at me with something approaching admiration. You know, when Harold first introduced us, he said you were tougher than you looked. I'm beginning to understand what he meant. I thought about Harold, about the way he'd loved me despite all my baggage, despite the complicated son who came with the package. He'd seen something in me that I'd forgotten existed, strength. Brian thinks he knows me, I said. He thinks I'm the same desperate woman who worked 3 jobs and sacrificed everything for his happiness. But that woman died when Harold died. The woman sitting here now is done being anyone's victim. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed Brian's number. Answer it, Marcus suggested. Let's see how he's feeling today. I picked up the phone, putting it on speaker so Marcus could hear. Mom. Brian's voice sounded different. Strained. We need to talk. We need to talk. Brian's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Genuine fear masked as urgency. I glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. About what, dear? There's been some kind of mix-up with the house sale. The buyers are saying there's a problem with the title. Something about a trust? Mom, what's a trust? The innocence in his voice was almost comical. After all these years of treating me like a confused old woman, Brian was finally admitting there were things he didn't understand. Oh, that, I said, keeping my voice light and casual. Harold set up some legal arrangements before he died. I never really understood all the details myself. Well, you need to figure it out fast. These people are threatening to sue me. They want their money back, and they're talking about involving lawyers. Marcus covered his mouth to hide a smile. I could hear the panic creeping into Brian's voice, though he was trying to maintain his usual controlling tone. Sue you? But why would they sue you if I'm the one who owns the house? Because. Brian paused, and I could practically hear him trying to figure out how to explain without admitting what he'd done. Because I handled the sale for you, remember? I'm the one who signed the papers. But you said everything was legal. You said you had the authority. I do have authority. The power of attorney gives me. He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to incriminate himself further. Brian, are you in some kind of trouble? A long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more like the 8-year-old boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Mom, I think I made a mistake. Marcus was taking notes, documenting everything Brian was admitting over the phone. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness watching my son's world crumble. What kind of mistake, sweetheart? The money from the sale. I had some debts I needed to pay. I thought I could handle it, you know? I thought I could sort everything out before you even noticed. How much debt, Brian? Another pause. More than I expected. More than the house money covered. All of it? Brian, did you spend all $7 million? I had to, Mom. These people, they don't mess around. They were going to hurt me if I didn't pay them back. Marcus raised his eyebrows and wrote something in his notebook. Brian had just admitted to using fraudulent sale proceeds to pay gambling debts. Another federal crime. Who were you going to hurt you? It doesn't matter. The point is, I need to fix this situation with the buyers. Can you call your lawyer and get this trust thing sorted out? I looked at Marcus, who shook his head slightly. We both knew there was no sorting out a trust that had been legally established to prevent exactly this scenario. I'll see what I can do, I said. But Brian, where did you think I was going to live if you sold my house? We talked about this yesterday. You could find a nice apartment, maybe one of those senior places with activities. With $5,000? Well, I thought maybe you had other money saved up. The casual way he dismissed my financial security made my chest tight with anger. Brian, that house was my retirement plan. The income from renting it, the equity I could access if I needed medical care. Did you think about any of that? Mom, you're being dramatic. You're only 66. You don't need to retire yet. You could get a job, stay active. Marcus was staring at the phone in disbelief. Brian was suggesting his 66-year-old mother get a job to support herself after he'd stolen her $7 million asset. What kind of job do you think I should get, Brian? I don't know. Something part-time. You worked before, you could work again. Before I could respond, I heard voices in the background of Brian's call. Sharp, angry voices. Brian? Is someone there with you? I have to go, Mom. Just call your lawyer, okay? Fix this trust problem. I'll call you later. The line went dead. Marcus and I sat in silence for a moment, processing what we just heard. He's in deeper trouble than we thought, Marcus finally said. Gambling debts to dangerous people. No money to pay back the buyers, and now he's asking you to somehow undo a legal trust to bail him out. What happens next? Well, the buyer's deadline is Friday. Today is Wednesday. If Brian can't produce either clear title or $7 million by Friday afternoon, they file criminal charges. Given what we just heard, I'd say the chances of Brian meeting that deadline are approximately 0. I walked to my living room window and watched a neighbor walking her dog. Such a normal, peaceful scene. It was hard to believe that just 2 houses down, my son was probably having the worst week of his life. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Of course. Am I doing the right thing? Letting this happen to Brian? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Marilyn, in 30 years of practice, I've seen a lot of families torn apart by money. I've seen children who felt entitled to their parents' wealth, who manipulated and abused the people who loved them most. He stood up and joined me at the window. Yesterday, your son committed multiple felonies. He stole $7 million from you and told you to live in a garage. Today he's asking you to help him cover up his crimes. At what point does protecting him stop being love and start being enablement? I knew he was right, but it didn't make it easier. He's still my son. And you're still his mother. But being a mother doesn't mean accepting abuse. Harold understood that. That's why he set up these protections for you. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Brian. Mom, please call your lawyer now. This is urgent. I showed the message to Marcus, who read it and shook his head. He's getting desperate. The pressure is building. How long do you think it will take for him to realize there's no way out? Probably right around Friday afternoon when the charges are filed. Another text came through. Mom, I'm scared. Please help me. For just a moment, reading those words, I felt the old maternal instinct kick in. The urge to fix things, to make the pain go away, to sacrifice whatever was necessary to protect my child. But then I remembered his voice yesterday. Go find some dirty garage to live in. I deleted the text without responding. Marcus, I want you to do something for me. What's that? I want you to call the buyer's attorney. Tell them about the trust, about the fraudulent sale. Give them copies of everything. I don't want Brian to have any false hope that this is going to just disappear. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's probably wise. The sooner everyone understands the real situation, the sooner this can be resolved. And Marcus? I want to be there when they arrest him. I want Brian to see my face and know that I chose not to save him this time. Marcus looked surprised. Are you sure about that? I thought about all the times I'd rescued Brian from consequences. All the bills I'd paid, the jobs I'd helped him get, the second chances I'd provided. All the ways I'd taught him that there would always be someone to catch him when he fell. I'm sure. It's time Brian learned what the real world looks like. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. Marcus had called the night before to confirm that the buyer's attorney would be filing charges at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Brian's deadline would expire in 6 hours, and from everything we could tell, he was no closer to solving his problem than he'd been 3 days ago. I was finishing my morning coffee when I heard the familiar sound of Brian's car in my driveway. But this time something was different. The engine turned off immediately, no idling, no hesitation. When I looked out the window, I saw him sitting behind the wheel with his head in his hands. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. When he finally got out of the car and walked to my door, I could see dark circles under his eyes and the kind of desperate exhaustion that comes from days without real sleep. The knock was soft, almost tentative. Nothing like the confident pounding I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Mom? It's me. Please, I need to talk to you. I opened the door and was shocked by how much he'd aged in just 3 days. Brian looked like a man who'd been carrying the world on his shoulders and was finally about to collapse under the weight. Come in, I said quietly. He stumbled into my living room and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands again. For several minutes, Neither of us spoke. I sat across from him, waiting, watching my son fall apart in real time. "They're going to arrest me today," he finally whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. "Who told you that?" The arrest was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting or resistance. When the federal agents knocked on my door, Brian simply stood up, straightened his wrinkled suit and walked outside with them. He looked back at me once through the window of their unmarked car, his face a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. I watched until they disappeared down the street, then closed my door and made myself a cup of tea. Marcus arrived an hour later, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into Harold's old chair. "Free," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it completely. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. With the recorded confession and clear evidence of fraud, Brian's attorney advised him to take a plea deal rather than risk a trial. He received 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole in 5 if he demonstrated good behavior and made restitution. The restitution part was complicated. Brian's hidden offshore account was seized, providing $200,000 toward the $7 million he owed. His condo, car, and other assets were liquidated, adding another $150,000. The remaining $6.65 million was considered a civil judgment that would follow him for the rest of his life. The buyers, understanding that they would never recover their full investment, agreed to accept the beach house itself as partial compensation. I signed the paperwork transferring the property out of the trust and into their names, receiving a small cash settlement that covered my legal fees and helped fund what came next. What came next was the most surprising part of the whole ordeal. 3 weeks after Brian's sentencing, I received a call from a woman named Janet whose voice I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Whitmore? My name is Janet Chen. I'm calling about your son Brian." My heart sank. I'd been dreading this call. Someone wanting money for Brian's legal defense, or asking me to visit him in prison, or trying to guilt me into providing support for his commissary account. "I'm sorry, but I'm not providing any financial assistance." "Oh no," Janet interrupted. "You misunderstand. I'm calling to thank you." "Thank me? I work for the district attorney's office," Janet continued. "We've been investigating a gambling operation that your son was involved with. His cooperation has helped us build cases against some very dangerous people." "Brian is cooperating?" "Very much so. He's provided detailed information about money laundering, loan sharking, and several other criminal enterprises. His testimony has already led to 12 arrests." I was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your son asked me to. He wanted you to know that he's finally taking responsibility for his actions. He's not asking for anything from you. He specifically told me not to ask for money or visits or letters. He just wanted you to know that he's trying to make things right." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the 8-year-old boy who used to help me fold laundry, and the 42-year-old man who was finally learning that actions have consequences. I never visited Brian in prison. I never sent money or letters or care packages. But I did follow his case through Marcus, who occasionally updated me on Brian's progress. He earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree through the prison education program. He worked in the prison library and taught literacy classes to other inmates. By all accounts, he was becoming the kind of man I'd always hoped he could be. It only took him 8 years and a federal prison sentence to get there. Meanwhile, I was building a life I'd never imagined possible. Without the constant drain of Brian's needs and emergencies, I discovered that Harold's inheritance was more than enough to support a comfortable, independent lifestyle. I sold the big house and bought a small cottage near the coast, close enough to smell the ocean but far enough from my old life to feel like a fresh start. I took up painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I joined a book club, learned to play bridge, and made friends who knew nothing about my complicated family history. For the first time in my adult life, I lived for myself. The cottage had a small guest room that I decorated simply but warmly. Sometimes I imagined that someday Brian might visit, that we might find a way to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. But I never counted on it. I'd learned the hard way that hope without boundaries was just another form of enabling. 5 years after Brian's arrest, I received a letter. The return address was a halfway house in Chicago. Dear Mom, it began. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I put you through, and I'm sorry. The letter was 2 pages long, handwritten in Brian's careful script. He wrote about the therapy he'd undergone in prison, about learning to recognize his narcissistic behavior patterns, about finally understanding the difference between love and manipulation. You saved my life by not saving me, he wrote. If you had bailed me out one more time, I would have destroyed both of us eventually. I'm grateful that you loved me enough to let me face the truth about myself. At the end of the letter, he included a check for $300. I know this doesn't even begin to cover what I owe you, he wrote, but it's what I can afford from my dishwashing job at a restaurant here. I'm sending you $300 every month for as long as it takes. It's not about the money. It's about learning to give instead of just take. I deposited the check not because I needed the money, but because I recognized it for what it was. Brian's first real attempt to show love through action rather than words. The monthly checks continued like clockwork. $300 every month, always accompanied by a brief note about his job, his therapy, his progress toward becoming self-sufficient. He never asked for visits or phone calls. He never requested money or favors. He just quietly demonstrated, month after month, that he was finally learning to be the son he should have been all along. 2 years later, I received a different kind of letter. Brian had been released from the halfway house and was living in his own apartment, working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization. He was engaged to a woman named Sarah who worked at the same nonprofit, someone who knew his full history and loved him anyway. We're getting married next month, he wrote. I know I have no right to ask this, and I'll understand if you say no, but Sarah would like to meet you. Not because we want anything from you, but because she says she can't truly know me without knowing the woman who raised me. I thought about it for weeks. Part of me was afraid that seeing Brian would bring back all the old patterns, the old enabling behaviors that had damaged us both for so long. But another part of me was curious about this man my son claimed to have become. I called the number he'd included in his letter. Hello. The voice was older, more mature than I remembered. Brian? It's your mother. A long pause. Then quietly, Hi Mom. Thank you for calling. We talked for 20 minutes. It was awkward at first, both of us feeling our way carefully around decades of hurt and resentment. But gradually, I began to hear something in Brian's voice that had never been there before. Humility. He didn't make excuses for his past behavior. He didn't try to minimize the damage he'd caused. He simply acknowledged what he'd done and expressed genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused me. I would like to meet Sarah, I said finally. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured. Brian, I'm 66 years old. I don't do anything I don't want to do anymore. He laughed, and for just a moment, it sounded like the little boy I'd raised so long ago. We met at a small restaurant halfway between our cities. Brian looked different, thinner, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. Sarah was a kind-faced woman in her 40s who shook my hand warmly and thanked me for coming. Brian told me about everything, she said simply. About his crimes, about how he treated you, about the consequences he faced. I want you to know that the man sitting here today is not the same person who hurt you. We had dinner and talked about safe topics: Sarah's work, Brian's job, my cottage by the ocean. As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected. This Brian was careful with his words, thoughtful about others' feelings, genuinely interested in my life rather than focused solely on his own needs. As we prepared to leave, Brian handed me an envelope. What's this? Just something I wanted you to have. Inside was a photo of Brian and Sarah at some kind of community event, serving food to homeless families. They both looked tired but happy, their faces glowing with the satisfaction that comes from helping others. We volunteer at a shelter every weekend, Brian explained. Sarah got me involved when I was still in the halfway house. It helps me remember that there are people in this world who have real problems, not just the manufactured crises I used to create for myself. I studied the photo, seeing something in my son's face that I'd never seen before. Peace. Thank you for this, I said. Thank you for not giving up on me, he replied. Even when that meant letting me go. I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because Brian and I had suddenly fixed our relationship. Trust doesn't rebuild that quickly. But because I finally saw evidence that my son was becoming a man worthy of respect. The monthly checks continued, and so did the occasional phone calls and letters. Brian and Sarah sent me a wedding photo. A simple ceremony at the courthouse, both of them beaming with quiet joy. A year later, they sent a photo of their adopted daughter. A 7-year-old girl named Emma who had been in foster care for 3 years. We wanted to give her the kind of stable, loving home I wish I'd appreciated when I had it, Brian wrote. I keep that photo on my mantle now, next to the picture of Harold in his garden. Sometimes I look at it and think about the grandfather Harold would have been, how he would have loved spoiling a little girl who needed extra love. And sometimes I think about the lessons it took both Brian and me far too long to learn. That love without boundaries isn't love at all, that enabling someone isn't the same as helping them, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to face the consequences of their own choices. I'm 71 now, living peacefully in my cottage by the sea. Brian is 47, a father and husband who has learned to measure his worth by what he gives rather than what he takes. We talk once a month and exchange Christmas cards. It's not the relationship I once dreamed of having with my son, but it's real and honest and built on mutual respect rather than obligation. And after 71 years on this earth, I've learned that real is always better than perfect. I never got my beach house back, but I got something better, my freedom. The freedom to live without fear, without constant crisis, without the exhausting weight of always being someone else's solution. Some nights I sit on my small deck listening to the waves and think about the woman I used to be. The one who sacrificed everything for a son who saw sacrifice as weakness. I don't mourn her anymore. She served her purpose, kept Brian alive long enough for him to grow up, even if it took 42 years and a federal prison sentence to complete the process. Now I'm someone different. Someone who knows the difference between love and enabling, between helping and hurting, between family and freedom. And for the first time in my life, that's enough.